began with for this thesis. And so my theoretical argument is grounded on addressing both aesthetics as a medium of perception and the artwork as this privileged object that encapsulates structural logic. And the ultimate aim was to elaborate the notion of the aesthetic unconscious, which would explicate a homologous relation between three structures, which are aesthetics, capital, and the unconscious. And so I wanted to be able to identify like moments without relying on artworks as illustrations of my ideas. So I think this is like haunting my research process. So like there's a tension here that's very present where, or like a threat where that guides me to sort of look at what I'm looking at and sort of try to avoid doing things I don't necessarily want to do. So these are, I guess, like what I'm sort of dealing with in terms of my current struggles. I started with three seminal texts which propelled these questions. And so first, the first text that I sort of was dealing with in coming up with the research process was a text by Frederick Jameson entitled Aesthetics of Singularity. And I'm just going to sort of name these three texts and then sort of share the key ideas that sort of encompass the general framework of what I'm trying to deal with very quickly, and it's kind of watered down. But so in this Jameson's text, there is a kind of shift from aesthetics as a science of the beautiful to aesthetics as a medium of perception. And then there's the notion of aesthetics as the language of the commodity, and therefore making the aesthetics the overarching rubric, or an overarching rubric for all spheres of production. And then there's an argument. So the general argument is that there's a cultural logic of this mode of production, that is the capitalist mode of production, which tends to the production of singulars. And so Frederick Jameson produces this cognitive map that shifts between aesthetics as a sphere and as objects, including the artwork itself and other forms of or other kinds of objects that make visible this this cultural logic that is always reproducing the singular. And so I thought that these were kinds of arguments that were made very quickly, but of course this essay relies on the book, the seminal book, which is Postmodernism and the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. But then this kind of short essay brought me also to another. So these texts are kind of like encapsulate encapsulate the framework of the research, but I don't sort of like it's sort of where I depart from. So then there's Walter Benjamin as another figure, and namely his artwork essay. So the work of art in the age of technological reproducibility, and sort of three notions that that are key and were elaborated in this essay. So first, there's a notion of aura decay, which I'll speak about later, but I'm just throwing them now, enumerating. So there's this notion of aura decay. There's another notion which is also a kind of shift from cult value to exhibition value. And that rang sort of similar with what Frederick Jameson was attempting to do. These are kinds of shifts that are particular to trying to identify what is this moment of the aesthetic as a medium of perception that is different than that of the aesthetic as a science of the beautiful, but also that the artwork kind of encapsulates uh, a logic that is made visible at a certain moment in time. Um, and then the third text, which is Kant's third critique of the faculty of judgment. And this one is the one which I wanted to rely on because I felt it lends itself to psychoanalytic theory of both aesthetics and the artwork. And so that's how I hope to articulate the question of the homology between these three structures. And so just to enumerate the key points that I was uh, uh, sort of looking at in the back of my research, so first, the faculty of judgment as necessarily presupposed as universal, the notion of pleasure without interest, and so that the question that follows, that is outside of Kant's sort of framework or realm of interest, which is who is it that is enjoying then? Is it the structure that is enjoying? And then the notion of the sensus communis, which is like this external sphere that is internalized, or the presence of an outside that is presupposed as always already inside and constitutive of this universal judging subject. And that's how I was interested in weaving kind of Lacanian notion of the extimate with Kant's third critique. But I'm sorry because I'm throwing these like concepts sort of vulgarly right now, but just to draw the map of what kind of concerns I was trying to deal with to elaborate this question of the aesthetic unconscious. So I can sort of start with explaining a bit what where I was with the research. But I just wanted to jump also to the end just super quickly because right now there are three objects, or I'm wrongfully calling them objects, but that I'm trying to articulate vis-a-vis the notion of this aesthetic rubric, which is namely the artwork and then its reception and its so who is it that's sort of doing the judgment and enjoying the artwork, disinterest without interest, and also the staging of the artwork, so the display. So I'll come back to why I thought like I'm dealing with these display and reception and its kind of synthesis in the artwork, and shifting from this to the aesthetic sphere at large. So back to Kant, where in his critique of the power of judgment, he explicates this the rigorous logic that is made visible at the moment of sense perception. Things are beautiful not by argument or analysis, but by perceiving. And the moment of perception is accompanied by a spontaneous judgment brought about by a kind of universal consensus that works akin to a rational law. And so for Kant, the aesthetic is a third mode of cognition that operates between subjective feeling and the abstract universal understanding. And so I jump from this to aesthetics pertaining to both this medium of perception and the mode of expression of the commodity. So aesthetics encompass all forms of perception, which are all subsumed under this commodity form. And it's first and foremost aesthetic and by way of aesthetics of the real abstraction, which designates the sphere of commodity language, or a kind of language that is particular to the commodity form, or what Marx calls the sensuous supersensuous of the commodity. And so Werner Hamacher writes in response to Derrida's Spectres of Marx book, writes an essay entitled Lingua Amisa, and he discerns two languages which Marx speaks. The first, the language of expression of the commodity, that is exchange value, and the language which speaks about and beyond this language of expression. And he further fleshes out this dual language as the doubling of a single language belonging to the structure of this very language, which is political economy. And the metaphor cloth speaks relates to the metaphor of like covering, veiling, and mystification and fetish, which bears significant importance in Hamacher's simultaneous readings of Derrida and of Marx's chapter on commodities and in Capital, Volume 1. And following Derrida's analysis, the commodity and its language possess an immeasurable dimension which concerns the commodity's messianic promise and the messianic of capital, which announces itself in the commodity. Hamacher explains that the analysis of spectrality in Derrida's work means both of the phenomenality of the commodity and the excess beyond its phenomenality. And so it's kind of paraphenomenal or like spirituality or spectrality. And this is expanded analysis of the commodity and of capitalism contains an analysis of its messianic power, or in Benjamin's words, messianic weakness. And so Marx's relative form of value shows the commodity language, which is structured as a suggestion of equality or a proposition of equivalence, which speaks by feigning the equivalence of the commodities. And when one element in the equation speaks with another, they're both promising their exchangeability, which is the only medium in which they can change into one another. And thus commodities promise one another commodity language, which is an abstract and speculative language which disregards all natural determinations and relies only on formal determinations pertaining to the abstract relation of equivalence. And so for this reason, it is both a language of exchange and of reversal or inversion. And so when a commodity enters into the chain of equivalences of commodities, it gives itself a value which it formerly lacked. And by doing so, it appears in the world of commodities, which means it appears for the first time as such. And at this moment, the commodity turns into the other of itself, first as an object of exchange, and then by virtue of exchange, an object of use. And this inversion, commanded by the logic of its language, enables the commodity to become an object only by first disappearing as an object and subjecting itself to the suprasensual objectivity of value. So the commodity speaks a historical language here, which claims to be universal and trans-historical at the same time. And this abstract language is limited to the single statement, value, and one grammatical structure, which is the equation, but claims itself to be valid for an unrestricted variety of singularities. And so Hamacher shows that the term commodity language is characterized by prosopopeia. And so commodities are neither natural things nor do they speak, rather they're things with supernatural quality and possess value whose substance is purely social. So this thing of value doesn't remain supernatural, for its supersensuousness becomes an objective quality and renders it sensuous suprasensuous. So sensuous in a suprasensuous in a sensuous way. And the commodity of which Marx speaks is itself structured as this prosopopeia. So because it's a commodity, it really speaks. And so the enigmatic character of the product of labor arises from the form of the value form of the commodity itself. And it's characterized by the objective form of commodity language, which stamps human labor with the objective character of products and the time of that labor with the character of value, and imprints the relations amongst producers with the character of relations between things. So the enigmatic character and the phantasmagoric form of the commodity, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. So its fetish character is not detachable from the commodity, and once detached, unveils its real character. And this fetish character is constitutive to the commodity and to bourgeois economy. They are thought forms, as Marx put it, which are socially valid and therefore objective for the relations of production belonging to this historically determined mode of social production. So I also bring up Marx's formulation, people are not aware of this, nevertheless they do it, which is repeated in sort of lots of seminal texts, but he further adds that they must do it when they are aware of it. And Hamaker's intervention explains that forms of knowledge can only be those of commodity language, thus must be a priori fetishistic. And so when Marx says the commodity language objectively veils social relations, instead of revealing them, it means that objects themselves are the veil that commodity language circulates as the social conditions of production. So the fetish is the objectivity of objects, and commodity language itself speaks only as a commodity, exchanging itself for equivalent commodities and serving the generation of surplus value of capital. And okay. So jumping to the structure logic of the commodity, which is that of the linguistic sign, they both share a common structure, namely language. And the conventional meaning and language and use value are replaced by the arbitrary mode of signification and valorization expressed in the term commodity language. And so value form of the commodity and its fetishistic semblance of self-referential differentiation can be addressed from the perspective of the social relation, that of the proletariat as the unconscious subject of exchange, and the object of political economy is presented with the linguistic medium, and the linguistic sphere and the sphere of political economy is intertwined in this linguistic medium of presentation and is symptomatic of the existence of structured homology between the different systems of value. And this homology is most apparent in joining Marx with Saussure and Lacan. And the logic of exchange value in political economy is made visible by the autonomy of the signifier, which is indebted to the advent of linguistic value via differential relations. And so the logic of use value and its symbolic mode of production of meaning shares its logic with an arbitrary mode of abstraction and signification. I bring up the work of Lévi-Strauss, who's reading Marcel Mauss in his introduction to the work of Marcel Mauss, where he expounds the concept of mana as a signifier functioning as the name for forces of attraction in primitive cultures, which Mauss studied. And Lévi-Strauss argues that mana presents the characteristics of a secret power and a mysterious force. His interpretation of mana demystifies the concept and reduces its rational connotation of a mythic or magical power to a precise symbolic function. And by analyzing it as a linguistic phenomenon. And this means that mana stood as a name for a structural feature of all human languages, which is treated as a substantial reality and resulting in the sublation of the force it was meant to dissolve. So the signifier mana is meant to reintroduce self-reflexivity into the signifying order. So this account on the concept of mana, which is structured around logical contradiction, departs from language as a bearer of meaning, which by definition arises all at once. And this sudden emergence of becoming human or like acquiring language or meaning or becoming a speaking being or being endowed with language indicates a gap and a discordance between two orders of the signifier and the signified. And so Lévi-Strauss maintains that the notion of the category of mana is meant to compensate for the discordance in the communicative flow with the symbolic system in order to enable the communicative intercourse and exchange. So mana performs as a general equivalent for surplus signification or like a floating signifier as a symbol in its pure state with zero symbolic value, and that serves as a point of equivalence or transfer for its circulation and distribution. Um, so um, um, so this symbol in its pure state lacks any determinate meaning, lacking any determinate meaning, stands for the presence of meaning as such, as opposed to the absence of meaning. Um, so there's a kind of linguistic excess or a surplus or an excess in signification, which corresponds to the idea of an impossible knowledge or something that is unknowable but excessively signified. And so mana stands for something that is missing in the space of possible knowledge of the world. And this knowledge that can't be known is a gap in the chain of signification that possesses surplus signification. So as a result, to become a subject is to be endowed with a particular kind of inadequacy. So that means being endowed with something that is always already withheld from comprehension and nevertheless insisting in the life of the subject as a speaking being. So in other words, the subject comes into the world endowed with this surplus lack or with this excess that he must bear with or she must bear with. And this it must bear with. So this is precisely the management or coping with mana and the management of this excessive lack. And I bring in Lacan, who looks at Levi-Strauss, Freud together and shows that there's a surplus signifier because something is always already missing from the space of meaning, which leaves the remnants of a void that is less than the nothing of a loss. And so something is added to life that is the remnant of a void, but that can't be equated to the nothing of an absence or a loss. And the impossible knowledge expressed in the mana type of surplus signifiers can only be unconscious. So the unconscious is the locus of the knowledge of this excessive lack, and the elaboration of this excessive signification is evidenced as an example in the dream work. But in order to explain the concept of this excessive lack, the Freud speaks about the game that children play in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, this fourth Da game. And so fourth Da is the playing with the here, absence and presence, gone and there. And so I'll just skip over this quickly, but the to the outcome of the game, which is to convert what would have otherwise been a trauma into a loss. And so the child is disturbed by the mother's absence, attempts to kind of make do with this loss. But what this means is that the form of life of the child inhabits is haunted by this missing link, or is marked by this namelessness, or this excessive lack. I will skip over this, but this kind of knowledge that can't be known is sort of present in back to Kant in his critique of judgment, where the notion of mana can be read here in Kant's effort to capture the surplus that has been seen to inform the subject's response and responsibility towards objects of beauty. So Kant elaborates in the third critique that we have no concept under which to subsume the beautiful object, but the claim is that we claim that they are beautiful, that it is beautiful, and we present it as having a binding claim that is normative. And so everyone ought to find it beautiful. And the way we know this is through pleasure. And pleasure knows something our cognition can't conceptualize, and he calls this taste. So grasping this normative knowingness is proper to the enjoyment associated with this most intimate sense, which is that of taste. And this opens up the problem which arises in the notion that the most private is supposed to open up the subject to the sensus communis. And here the notion of the aesthetic unconscious can be first deciphered. in this notion of the sensus communis. And so the problem of taste presents itself as that of another knowledge that can't account for its judgments, but enjoys them nevertheless, by way of another form of pleasure that knows and judges. And so what is tasted in the taste that informs aesthetic judgment is, like Levi-Strauss argued with respect to mana, not substantial reality, but rather that which in the object is pure signification. So in a sense, taste is connected to mana in that there is a maniacal enjoyment which has to do with some surplus of signification. Okay. So how long do I have?
You can, I mean, it depends on how much time you want for discussion. So
I think I can stop because, yeah, or I can continue. I can continue.
I mean, if you have some thoughts that you need to that will help wrap things up, then go ahead, you know.
Okay, yeah. So these kinds of I am aware that these are like sort of theoretical discussions that I'm bringing forth. Right now I'm trying to kind of negotiate with these, but at the same time try to focus on the different moments that that accompany the artwork, and what that kind of makes visible. I was looking at artworks that sort of encapsulated or like made visible or had a kind of disruptive effect that sort of revealed a structure. And so there's a reason why I was like thinking of some of Duchamp's works as and however humorous they are, this kind of makes visible a form of presenting a logic of capital, or presenting kind of a structure to the viewer by way or by means of the artwork, but also kind of looking at the situation of displaying the artwork as the staging of mana. So I think there's a I think I'd like to hear like what you think about how I can perhaps sort of move forward with these questions and sort of try to arrive at a means to deal with these other questions. So yeah.
Yeah, so you can take questions now.
Can I ask something for clarification? Because we have an audience maybe that is not necessarily terribly well versed in all these theories that you're bringing up. I'm going to ask you a very difficult thing to do, if possible. Like if you could, in a few sentences, kind of conclude about the homologies, right, between aesthetics and the language of commodities, what is it that you're looking at? What is the aesthetic unconscious, right? What do you mean by
that? So there's, I think I was just trying to deal with two notions of aesthetics that are presented as sort of shift from one to another, but both point to this kind of space that aesthetics open up to. The aesthetics as science of the beautiful and aesthetics as a medium of perception both present this kind of realm of aesthetics that is a kind of external realm that is internal to the subject. So the argument that there is an aesthetic unconscious is attempting to kind of argue for this internalization of an outside by way of like judgment with Kant, or by way of the understanding of how the commodity form is sort of understood in critical theories as an aesthetic form, or like, yeah. So does that summarize something? Okay.
So do we have any questions?
My dog is barking, but maybe someone whose dog is not barking can first speak. I'll mute. Okay, the dog stopped, if I may. So you mentioned the Tushanian moment of, artwork kind of as signaling a disturbance within the institutional structures of art, but also aesthetic reception, destabilizing those structures and hence revealing them, right? So I'm wondering, like, if you thought about kind of what happens to the repetitions of these gestures of singularity, let's say in our late capitalist moment of hyper-commodification, whether, such disturbance or revelation, right, is possible, or even if it's possible, to what end, right? Maybe like a stupid example, like Maurizio Cattelan's bananas. I don't know, like, or any other stupid example that we could find.
Yeah, and also I wanted to bring up the thanks, Angela, and I wanted to bring up there's another moment that I was also kind of looking at in terms of this display notion, or like, what does display do or present? And there's François Lyotard produced this exhibition in Pompidou called Les Immatériaux. And I thought that this was another moment where, this philosopher, theoretician is producing kind of installation artwork that is attempting to grapple with this, the modes of display, or like display itself as kind of a staging. So I thought this also, I don't know if you think it's a kind of relevant thing to kind of connect here, or rather remain within this kind of Duchamp and repetition of gesture, or gesture as a kind of mode of production of artworks that was also produced in the 90s in Beirut as well, with Akram Zaatari, Walid Sadeh, and Ziad Abilama. So I don't know if, yeah.
I myself have to think about it. It's been a while since I did the exhibition. But we can get back to that conversation together at some point.
So I realize I threw at everyone like a lot of theoretical questions and not a lot about like the process necessarily. But I don't know.
Walid has a question for you.
Yeah. Hi, Andrea. Thank you for the presentation. A question a bit from someone who's not fully versed in the literature you're mentioning, but a basic question. And from Freudian psychoanalysis, we understand that the unconscious is primarily formed by repression, right? Repression forms the unconscious. My question to you is that something that could be interesting for you to consider? All right, because it seemed like the way you presented your premise, there is no repression in it. It seems, and therefore there's no pleasure. That's my other question to you. Yeah, and to clarify here, the notion of pleasure, you know, Rosalind Krauss wrote a book called The Optical Unconscious, right? Where she brings in, you know, the problematic of pleasure back into looking at art. So, I mean, my question is a bit disjointed, but just to clarify two things. What about repression as the necessary prerequisite for the formation of the unconscious? And two, what about pleasure? The pleasure of looking at things, right? How does that fit in your theoretical construct?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I will be engaging in the lit review with Rosalind Krauss's book. But yes, so the way I was kind of addressing this was in terms of not so much like the Freudian reading of repression being constitutive to the unconscious, but in terms of reading Freud through Lacan, as there's a kind of extimate sphere that is constitutive to the formation of the unconscious, and that's how I kind of make a case for this notion of aesthetics as a form of unconscious, or like there being an aesthetic unconscious. But I need to engage with reception in terms of perhaps affective reception as well. But I was first kind of dealing with reception in terms of what Kant, which I realize Kant's third critique is kind of like sort of rejected, but in terms of how he maintains this disinterested subject. What is this disinterested subject that allows for kind of art criticism of the sort that is kind of like presupposed as universal, but of course really isn't necessarily. But that presupposition is key for the sphere of or like the articulation of what the art object presents, and the possibility for art criticism is that it relies still on this kind of notion that there is an aesthetic fear of judgment, even though like later other theories kind of sort of depart from sort of detach from this kind of notion. So
could you share the text by Lacan you're referring to?
Sure, okay.
Or the seminar or whatever. So
okay, I can send something.
Because that seems to be a pivotal issue in your discussion. It would be good to read it and maybe come, return with some questions or feedback to you.
Okay, thank you.
Sami, you looked like you had a question.
Yes, maybe more commentary. And first of all, Andrea, thank you so much. That was amazing. You clarified a lot for my work, actually, while I was listening to you. So I'm a bit jealous, of course, now. So I just, the one moment of a kind of epiphany that I had while listening to you was, of course, structure is unconscious. And of course, if we see the homology on the level of structure and the, let's say, not unattainability, or the impossibility of giving a presentation to structure, if we could actually symbolize it fully or represent it, then it would be a structure. So of course the problem of the aesthetic is there already through a question of presentation or Darstellung. So that is completely clear. And also then it came, it occurred to me that I have to share this with you because we are now editing this book of our unfortunately late friend, as you know, Jan Sieber, whose book is actually on Lacan and Kant's third critique, the aesthetic unconscious. And we hope to have a short version. I mean, there is a short version already available in English, and I must send this to you because it speaks so much to your work, which is amazing. And what is the status of Urteilskraft, force, power, the power of judgment, this kind of strange force could actually be linked to the moment of maybe commodity language in Marx. I was very convinced of that when I listened to you, but when Walid asked his question about repression, I also thought we could also think about repression as structural, also as kind of transcendental, quasi-transcendental or primordial repression. And if we have that, we could say what is being repressed in the speech acts of commodity language is, of course, the negativity of class struggle. Or remember Walter Benjamin, who said with Karl Marx, there is an inferno that wages or rages within the soul of the commodity. It's repressed, yet structurally. And if you say there is structural repression, that of course leads to repetition. And then I thought, wow, you made this point with Jameson and the aesthetics of singularity, the repetition of so-called unrelated singularities maybe is a kind of almost neurotic tick that comes out of structural repression that ensures the functioning of commodity language, that we can actually exchange our labor power here through Zoom or through other media that we have. So I was very convinced of this. So it's less of a question. It's more like, how would you put these threads all together?
Okay, thank you. This work is totally indebted to you and Angela, and so thanks, Sami. I think that this is precisely the problem that I'm trying to grapple with, to make a case for this aesthetic unconscious. The notion of this kind of originary repression as a key presupposition for this kind of this structure seems to already be, or like I'm reading it into Kant's third critique. So this is how I guess I'm trying to kind of deal with this notion. So repression, the notion of repression kind of appears key in this manner as structural repression, which I must kind of sort of explicate clearly, I guess. I don't know if I answered the question, or if you want to ask something else, I can clarify. I don't know.
We cannot answer that. This is actually what we have to research. So
yeah, I mean, like how to sort of bring those together. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
If just maybe like one last thing from me at least. I mean, kind of continuing Sami's comment about the structural repression of negativity, but also like homologous to the structural repression of the negativity of class, you know, kind of in an Adornian sense, the repression of the negativity of the artwork, especially if you kind of translate it into the lingua franca of artwork as commodity, like the language of the artwork as a commodity. I had a question, I had another thread to follow with this, but I'm wondering if this is kind of a point you are making, but also whether, you know, in Jameson's aesthetic of singularity, that negativity for aesthetics is no longer viable, right? I mean, this is probably like, that's how I read Jameson. In installation art, when he talks about curating as a gesture, the unrepeatable construction of an artwork then dissolves without kind of leaving any historical traces or historical continuity, or gluing into some kind of a logic of history through you know, styles or schools and so on. I'm wondering, like, if in Jamesonian sense, aesthetics artwork is no longer like withholds a, or becomes a marker, or has encapsulates a kind of a negativity. Could we say that, or am I kind of vulgarizing?
No, my understanding is that this is so. Frederick Jameson's Benjaminism, his readings of Benjamin, sort of point me to understand that there are works of art that are or like similar to this Benjaminian reading of when the work of art kind of appears. But right now, there's this, you are faced with this abyss of representation. And so, of course, like it seems like for Frederick Jameson, then there is, then this negativity is kind of impossible, impossible to kind of represent. So, yeah.
Faris has a question.
Yeah. Hello, Andrea. Yeah, me just. So my question is, don't you think that certain discourse represses artistic production in its specificity? Because it seems to me that, I might be wrong, that the approach, at least from what I heard and what I could get, that I'm not, the talk about the artwork is usually made in general, like the artwork. We don't really understand what is that, or what exactly is being made in an artwork. It seems that it's an object in general, which is used to sustain the application of a number of theories, be it the Lacanian, the Marxist, the Jamesonian, or so I wonder if, and there are some fundamental moves, like if I hear well, is art as commodity. So I wonder how much this concept or this equation, art as commodity, can grasp what is really going on in an artistic work. This is one question, because anything can be thought as a commodity, but I think it's a right move to think it as a commodity. But in that case, we will be thinking it as a commodity and not as, let's say, an artistic production or something happening in that sphere. So for me, this is the first question: is if we reduce the artwork to the expression of the unconscious, or its support, or to the commodification, I think, at least this is what I think, we lose its specificity. On that case, you can maybe expand on the example of Duchamp and how Duchamp is a capitalist in a way. This is what I heard, if I heard you correctly, because I think that in Duchamp, there's much more going on, like in presentification of the structure and the problems, artistic problems of his time. So this is the first question. Second question for bibliographical references. So as usual, I think the authors that are missing are Foucault and Deleuze, and I tell you why. First, Foucault, because I think his concept of regime of visibility, the regimes of visibility of Foucault are able to articulate the artistic form and not an artistic object in general to the regimes of power. For example, if you take one of his regimes of visibility is readability, reading, and he shows you how reading is common to the Fordian kind of approach and to a number of artworks. And there's a kind of link here, which I think, at least from what I'm hearing, has touches on the inner structure of the artwork. And the other one is the typologies of the images of Deleuze. You have artworks comes in types, and they are magnification of structural living movement. And he has many texts on the relation between capital and, let's say, Hollywoodian cinema, where he shows you concretely how the mode of perception related to the conquest of the West actually is brought and magnified in movies like John Ford or in paintings like those of Hopper and others. So what I'm trying to say is or me, what I would, if I may, I would push you in that direction, because it seems to me that what is being really repressed is the artistic works themselves. Like the artistic works are absent, and what you have is a discourse that really comes above practically the whole of the art in general. So if you would like to reply to these critiques and and clarify maybe on the example of Duchamp or some other example, this way I can feel concretely what is going on.
Okay.
If you wish.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so you're about bringing up Deleuze as an example out of others, then the how how the Deleuze is looking necessarily at the status of the art object is precisely also my interest. Although I come to it from another side, so using like Benjamin and Jameson, and but I'm not trying to equate commodity and artwork. The artwork is a commodity, but I'm not sort of equating commodity equals artwork. I am starting from trying to, like you said, which is like not starting from artworks, but starting from the status of the artwork and what that does and what that reveals. And so this is why like discussion of the commodity is precisely relevant to what the artwork is kind of staging as artwork, as this form artwork. But my interest in particular artworks, I'm trying not to use them as mere illustrations of an explication of what this form of the artwork is doing. But I perhaps I can engage, I would like to engage with the Deleuze and sort of in contradistinction with other people I'm engaging. But yeah, like the Duchamp example, I didn't bring like a particular artwork, but for me, I don't know what you all think, but I was kind of thinking about a kind of methodology that is elaborated in Duchamp's work, let's say, the ready-made and let's say the example of the door, there's something happens where there's something that is presented and sort of that kind of causes a disruption on many levels. But I'm looking at it in terms of what this kind of disruption would sort of present. Not necessarily in terms of like his artistic intention, but in terms of what the objects kind of make visible. This is why I thought perhaps Duchamp might be an interesting example. Also, this attached to this being presented with, for instance, Duchamp's ready-made, there's a kind of also other things that happen that are also disruptive, like this dimension of humor. A lot of them are very humorous. So I was also interested in kind of dealing with what exactly is happening here and what is this disruption of the status of the art object that is key for like Duchamp as an example. I don't know if this is like clarifying why I was looking at Duchamp.
Yeah, I thought you relate him to capitalist kind of. He presents something and it's really. I didn't get your formulation exactly, but in relation to Capital. Now, for the humor, he has a lot of writings on the spun and the spin. You know, like playing on the words that spins on each other, like the door that spins, and there are reasons like that in his writings. It's clear that he wants to create an undefined object that is going to spin and spun between art and non-art. For his critique that is related to him. But I wonder how this can relate to, for example, if it relates to Capital. But for me, I just wanted some concrete examples to see what is being said. How do you relate that to capitalist critique, or he's a capitalist, or he's expressing an unconscious. I need to, you know,
yeah,
to get it.
so I don't think Duchamp is a critic of capital, or like, but I think that the art or some artworks can, or like they are being sort of read as adequate critiques of capital, let's say. But I am interested in these objects in terms of what they presented for me to make a case for this kind of homology. There are several things happening at several levels of structures that are in this kind of moment of the, let's say, the ready-made, or like the door, as the example here. The door is kind of, I'm not necessarily looking at like what he intended for his brief for the production of the door, but what the door sort of presents the to the viewer, also what it kind of does in terms of like relations between viewer and or receiver.
Can you please name these things, just because?
Okay. Okay.
What does it
as
relation other than his?
Okay, like the door as a kind of ready-made itself being presented as art object, presenting sort of different relations and relations of production and mode of production. Also the door as sort of in the moment of it, but this is like now, like I'm thinking with you now, because these were just intuitions. So and then the door being representing the viewer, this kind of humorous moment. What is it exactly about this kind of ready-made that is funny? Why is it that it kind of hits, or it's tactile to the viewer? And also I'm trying to think about what kind of displaying this ready-made in such a manner as a kind of gesture or gesturally, what the artwork becomes here in this situation is this gesture. It resides in this kind of synthesis of viewer artwork and sort of the artwork being displayed. And so I don't like really know how I'm going to make a case for looking at Duchamp's work necessarily yet, but this is what I'm kind of thinking about.
Yeah, I see. But for me, these are the categories that I consider are a bit too general, like gesture, viewer, what it does, institution in general. Because for me, with that, you can put practically a lot of things which are not specific. I think really Duchamp is in a very specific niche, which is conceptual art, dealing with the context of the art. And for him to get his ready-made where it took him a lot of work to if you read the Duve essay, he traces the history of how he got his urinal in the museum, at least in the gallery. So for me, it's these categories that I think, or I'm criticizing, which are gesture, viewer, commodity, and unconscious. For me, they are too general. They are too big for the artistic object. Unless someone can show me really concretely how, let's say, Duchamp is a capitalist, or how this is working, for me, it remains too general. I will stop here to give the speech for others, but we can continue arguing whenever you want.
And then we sent him to the Gulag.
Ziad, you have a question?
I did, yes. As the token anthropologist in the room, I have a anthropology-related question. Thank you for the talk, Andy. It was brilliant. I walked in a bit late. I caught the word mana, but I'm really interested in the question of homology between mana and something in Kant I'm going to get to right now. It's really quite interesting, especially with how Lévi-Strauss changed the way that mana is read and within anthropology, because essentially, I mean, in the first place, it was taken as a form of an authority of collective representation. And in one of the letters Marcel Mauss was writing in great shame about how it corresponds to the collective mind, that the individual could find the basis and sustenance for his liberty, his independence, his personality, and his critique. But with Lévi-Strauss, his first formulation relied on somewhat of an empirical sense, but then he transformed it into a purely formal and transcendental theory. What I'm wondering is, if we're talking about signification and we're talking about mana as this kind of floating fire, this positive element that is not is not a remnant, that has no qualities, no meaning, no definition. Could we think of it homologically? I mean, or in homology to Kant, can we think of it as a transcendental scheme, schema? It's a question I've actually been thinking about recently. But yeah, because a lot of people often kind of think of the transcendental scheme as an image, but it's not. So, but yeah, I mean, it's just a question I've been having. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ziad. Yeah, this is so helpful because it also relates to Sami's point. For me, I think that this positing mana as a transcendental schema is a necessary presupposition that I think like it's necessary to do this within the standpoint of like looking at this within capital. So there's something that happens that makes it susceptible to seeing mana as this, you know, trans historical kind of thing, and also sort of as this kind of, it has to be it has to be presupposed as originary of this whole structure, let's say, or for it to work. And so linking it to Kant, I don't know how articulate, I'm not being articulate right now, but like this is what I guess I'm trying to work with, is that linking this to Kant's third critique, in that there is something of this kind of argument being posited when he speaks of the faculty of judgment as kind of this presupposition of or like necessary presupposition, in the same manner mana as a kind of necessary presupposition. Does this make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? So Andrea, when are you ready to defend?
No. No.
I'm hoping that, you know, some of the feedback that you got will help you pull something together in time. I'm assuming you're defending sometime in December, right?
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll be hearing from you again in another public forum, right, at the defense. Yeah, so thanks everybody for joining us. And if you guys have any other questions for Andrea, I'm sure she'd appreciate it if you emailed her, or, you know, maybe those who wanted to share sources, you know, maybe Andrea, if you want to send the link with the sources that you mentioned, and I can send them to everybody on the mailing list. Angela, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, thanks. Thank you, Andrea. It was very stimulating conversation. And I look forward to receiving your draft.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it was very brave of you to do this at this time before defending a proposal. You know, it's not an easy thing to do. So really appreciate that you did this. And I think it's a good dry run.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. I will be sharing the link to the talk today, the recording through email, but if someone wants it, you could just email me. Bye.
Thank you, bye.
Bye, thank you. Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you.